On a hot summer day, a big problem awaited a Boeing 747, one of the world's largest jets. The pilots could not rightly predict what was about to happen. The accident of Transworld Airlines caused many question marks around the world. Transworld Airlines Flight 800, which caused many changes in aviation rules after it happened, was prepared according to official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. July 17, 1996. JFK Airport, one of the 3 airports in New York. According to the plan, they planned to fly from New York to Paris, France, and from there to Rome. Transworld Airlines was a company that served from 1930 to 2001 and played a major role in the development of aviation. After 70 years of service, in the early 2000s, they could not escape bankruptcy and were acquired by American Airlines. The plane that was to operate the flight was a Boeing 747-100, the legendary model of Boeing with tail number November 93119. The company had just added the 25-year-old aircraft with a total of 93,300 hours to its fleet. Before this flight, the pilots coming from Athens did not notice any abnormalities on the plane. After approaching the apron, the plane was refueled without knowing what was going to happen. The crew that would pick up the plane in New York would be a new rested crew. 212 passengers boarded the giant jet. The plane was almost half empty. Under normal conditions, the plane was supposed to be at the runway at 7 p.m. But the pilot's departure was delayed when news came that the luggage of one of the passengers had been loaded onto the plane and the passenger was not on board. Later, the pilots received news from the center that the passenger they had been waiting for was already on the plane. Just 10 years before this accident, 329 passengers had lost their lives after another Boeing 747 belonging to Air India exploded as a result of unclaimed luggage. Since that accident, it had been forbidden to take a flight in case of unclaimed luggage. The flight crew in the cockpit consisted of 4 people. The pilots completed their preparations and started pushback. In the captain's seat was the experienced 58-year-old Captain Ralph. He had 40 years of flying experience, 31 years with TWA, and 9 years in the Air Force. In the right seat was another captain, Stephen, who had been with TWA for 32 years and was as experienced as the captain. Behind them was Richard, a 63-year-old flight engineer, and next to Richard was Oliver, a 25-year-old engineer who had just started flight engineering and was in training. He had been a private pilot for 4 years before working here. The 25-year-old had joined the company just 26 days earlier. After a long wait, an hour behind schedule, the plane finally completed its taxi and received clearance from the ATC to enter runway 22 and take off. The controller gave the pilots clearance for entry and takeoff. The pilots had made their taxi with 3 of the 4 engines of the aircraft. They had started their engine number 3 while taxiing. The reason for this was that the engine had just come out of maintenance, and the maintenance team had instructed the pilots to do so. The controller said that the wind was coming from 240 degrees at 8 knots. The pilots started to gain speed on the runway by giving power to all 4 engines. As the clock showed 2020, the pilots completed their takeoff with a delay of 1 hour and 20 minutes. The weather was light windy and the sky was partly cloudy. The takeoff and the climb were going smoothly. The conversations that are now on the screen are real conversations between the controller and the pilots. You can find the full ATC conversations in the YouTube video in the description section.
Lifeguard 800 heavy, 8,200 climbing 11,000.
800 Boston Center, Roger, climbing maintain 13,000.
Base 800 heavy, climbing maintain 13,000.
The airspace in New York was very crowded and the controller had to constantly change the altitude of the planes to maintain separation. As they were climbing to 13,000 feet, the controller reconnected and told them to accelerate the climb to 15,000 feet, but then he realized that there was other traffic nearby. So he changed the instruction and told them to maintain 13,000 feet.
Roger, sir, climb and maintain at level 190 and expedite 215.
800, man, the altitude maintain 13,000, 13,000 only now. 800 heavy, okay, stop climb at 13,000. 800, your traffic at 1 o'clock and 7 miles southbound, 1,000 foot above you, east 1900. Base 800 heavy, no contact.
The captain noticed something strange only 9 minutes after takeoff. There was an anomaly in the fuel flow indicator to engine number 4. The fuel gauge was showing an increase and decrease. but it recovered within seconds. The pilots thought it was an ordinary event and continued to focus on the flight. The controller reconnected to the pilots and instructed them to climb to 15,000 feet.
800, climb, maintain 15,000. 800, heavy, climb and maintain 15,000, 3,000.
This was the last conversation with the pilots. Within seconds, when they were at 13,800 feet, there was a huge explosion followed by a tremor. The crew could not understand what had happened. Within 5 seconds after the explosion, the cockpit was separated from the fuselage. The cockpit part was detached from the cabin. The cockpit was falling rapidly upside down. The fuselage continued to climb for a while due to their speed. The cabin was on fire with the explosion, so some of the eyewitnesses on the ground mistook the fuselage for a missile. Unable to climb any further, the fuselage could not hold on in the air and began to fall sideways. The remaining part of the fuselage disintegrated in the air before the wreckage fell into the water.
We just saw an explosion for amateurs. It was about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water.
There were pieces of debris floating on the water. Because the plane was filled with tons of fuel, the pieces were on fire, even though they had fallen into the water. Now we can see in the image on the screen that we can see the flaming pieces at dusk. The explosion was seen by pilots on other planes that were in the air at the time. The pilots entered the frequency to relay the situation to the controller.
We just saw an explosion out here, 5507. 5507, I'm sorry, I missed it. You're at 18, did you say something else? We just saw an explosion for amateurs. It was about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water. Boston Virgin 009, I could confirm that out of my 9 o'clock position. We just had an explosion out there about 5 miles away, 6 miles away. It's Center for Stinger B 507. We are directly over the site with that airplane or whatever it was just exploded and went into the water.
Initially, everyone thought it was a missile attack from the ground. The FBI argued that the wreckage showed signs of an explosion and that there was explosive material on the wreckage. The National Transportation Safety Board said this was not yet certain, but it was not reported in the press. Investigators collected all the pieces of wreckage in an old abandoned aircraft factory. The black boxes of the plane were found, but the data they obtained did not give investigators many clues. Boeing 747s continued to operate all over the world, so investigators needed to identify the problem as soon as possible to ensure safety. In order to better understand the crash, they put the entire wreckage together piece by piece like a jigsaw puzzle. The work that the researchers did after the crash was really incredible. First of all, they divided the wreckage area into 3 zones. In Zone 1, if they could find the pieces that broke off at the moment of the explosion, they could understand what caused the crash. The investigators were quite surprised when they saw the deformed piece that they pulled out of the area, because the piece they found was the center fuel tank, which was the largest fuel tank of the plane. The cockpit was separated from the fuselage as a result of the explosion in the fuel tank. Apart from that, as the FBI said, they did not find a chemical explosive on the plane. It is known that the plane exploded in the air, but there was no trace of soot from the explosive. The fuel in the central fuel tank had been emptied before the flight. The fuel loaded on the wings was sufficient for the first flight leg. So how did the empty fuel tank catch fire? There were about 140 kilos of unused fuel at the bottom of the fuel tank, and this fuel had vaporized due to the heat. Could the vaporized fuel have ignited as a result of a possible spark? There were many unknowns at this point. How did the fuel get hot enough to vaporize, and what was the factor that would ignite the fuel? The air conditioning systems were on before and during the flight because the weather was very hot that day. The center of the air conditioning system was exactly under this fuel tank. The unit of the system, which blows cold air into the aircraft, was getting hotter every minute. Due to the delay of more than 1 hour, the system heated the small amount of fuel in the fuel tank, causing the fuel to vaporize. There was also no insulation between the air conditioning unit and the fuel tank. The maximum temperature of the fuel was 36.4 degrees Celsius. But unfortunately the temperature reached 51.7 degrees Celsius when the pilots reached 13,800 feet. If they had not waited so long for what they thought was unclaimed baggage, the air conditioning units would not have gotten so hot and would not have heated the fuel tank so much. Perhaps this accident would never have happened. Although the question of how the fuel was heated was cleared, it was not known where the spark that would cause the flash came from. When the National Transportation Safety Board re-examined the cockpit voice recorder, they determined that there were split-second interruptions in the electrical system and that there was a short circuit in the aircraft. Many of the cables inside the aircraft were passing very close to the central fuel tank. According to investigators, the spark caused by the short circuit, combined with the evaporating fuel, caught fire and caused an explosion. Jet fuel is in a liquid form that cannot burn, but in this case, the fuel had vaporized due to the air conditioning units running for hours. The vapor state of the fuel becomes combustible when it combines with oxygen. A short circuit occurred due to old cables near the fuel tank and the fuel caught fire. The investigations lasted 4 years. The investigators said that the electrical networks of the Boeing 747s should be checked as a result of the investigations. The insulation between the central fuel tank and the air conditioning units was also among the items of the investigators. In memory of the 230 people who lost their lives in the crash,